Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming to our opening tonight. Tonight we have the opening for the newest Arcadia University Research Collaboration exhibition titled Jamar Nicholas Worldbuilding, which will be on display through February 16th. My name is Samantha Schaefer. I am a senior art history major here at Arcadia, and I am an ARC intern, and I had the privilege of working with the great people that you see in front of you now. But before I introduce them, there are a few thanks that are due, especially to Jamar Nicholas, Richard Torchia, Matthew Borgen, Mike Manley, and all of the work-study students and interns that, with their dedication, this exhibition opening reception was possible. And also great thanks to John and Teresa Rollins, whose gift funded this exhibition. So tonight we are going to have a panel discussion. So I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers, Jamar Nicholas, Mike Manley, and Matthew Borgen. Before they get started, let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Jamar Nicholas is an artist and educator. From 2003 to 2005, he served as an editorial cartoonist at the Philadelphia Tribune. His graphic novel, Fist Stick Knife Gun, was adapted from Jeff Canada's personal memoir. Fist Stick Knife Gun received recognition at the Glyph Awards and won many awards, such as Story of the Year in 2010. Nicholas is currently working on his graphic novel, Leon, Protector of the Playground, expected at the end of the year. Mike Manley is a comic artist and painter. Throughout his career, he has worked for Marvel, DC Comics, and Dark Horse. In 1991, he co-created the character Dark Hawk, and he has contributed to titles such as Batman and Captain America. Manley currently illustrates the running comic Judge Parker, which is a nationally syndicated comic. Currently, Manley is the editor of Draw Magazine and is in his second year of his MFA at PAFA. And Matthew Borgen is going to be moderating our talk tonight. He is the ARC exhibition coordinator. So questions are welcome at the end of the discussion, and let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. She also failed to mention that I'm not even a very closeted comic book nerd who's been collecting actively since I was 10 years old.
You're a collectivist.
I'm a collectivist, so that's what qualifies me to moderate this panel discussion with these gentlemen. The title of the exhibition is called Jamar Nicholas Worldbuilding. The exhibition's intent, just to kind of summarize, is to take a look into the process by which Jamar, and really comic book artists or artists in general, go about the creation of the characters, environments, all the things that would surround the kind of storytelling, not only in sequential art, which is what we're going to be focusing on, but really sort of storytelling in general. Hopefully we'll be able to sort of flesh that out a little bit. So even though we do have some of Jamar's published work on display, a lot of what you see in the exhibition are drawings that sort of exist sort of beforehand. It's the process that's taking place as these ideas are developing to create an entire world or an entire universe so that these characters that he's creating, telling a story about, feel well-rounded, feel realistic, have a sense of depth, because they have a world in which they inhabit. So maybe the first sort of question I want to put out to you guys is to maybe talk about the question of world building. If you want to maybe sort of talk about it in terms of how you understand it in general terms, but then I would also put forward the question, since it is a phenomenon that takes place in a lot of different media, how you think one goes about world building specifically in a sequential art or sort of comic book genre. And so I will put the question to Jamar first, because his name's on the exhibition.
Because my name's on the wall. Well, as far as I'm concerned, world building, as far as sequential art or comics are concerned, starts with the main character. Everything starts with the main character, and then it kind of builds out from there with me. It's super important that your main character is accessible, is relatable, and is individual and outstanding on his own right. And then from there, you can add to that person with supporting characters and supporting environments, and on and on. So I always start at the beginning with the character. What's this person's deal? Why is a reader going to be interested in that? Or what's going to make the reader want to follow us through this journey with this character? You know, basically, why do you care? Why do I want to read more of this? And then the world building part of supporting the characters, that's why they're called supporting characters, is to kind of build up, I didn't mean to say build too many times, but to lift up this character and make everything else around him just as interesting. One interesting thing that I like to talk about is the Boba Fett effect. I kind of named it this. The Boba Fett effect is in Star Wars, obviously. Some of you haven't seen Star Wars, and I know who you are.
Somebody's probably wearing Boba Fett right now.
Some cosplayers in the audience. When George Lucas and all those wonderful people over there made Star Wars, there was a scene with this really cool guy with a helmet on, a bucket on his head, and a little shotgun, and he was just in the corner just leaning, and everybody's like, who's that guy? He's awesome. And then they kind of went back and said, I don't know. I guess his name's Boba Fett. And you can't really control who people relate to in a story. Sometimes it's not the person you thought would be the glue of the story. Maybe it's Boba Fett. But again, you know, having characters like that enriches the story and the universe.
Yeah. Which is interesting because, you know, if you talk about sort of generating a world for a film, there's a lot of this sort of characterizations or identities that have to be created in the real world, or at least for the purposes of the set, and then they might not be fully fleshed out, where perhaps with sort of comic art, maybe you don't have that same kind of luxury to be able to almost backfill as you go, or maybe you do. But so again, I was I want to kind of put it to both of you. Is there something specific in terms of creating comics or creating sequential art in relationship to world building that is sort of fundamentally, maybe it's fundamentally different from, say, like creating a film, creating a piece of literature, that kind of thing?
Well, one of the interesting things about Star Wars is that everything in Star Wars comes from something else. So Lucas was very heavily influenced by comics and, you know, other science fiction things. But for instance, like Darth Vader is really sort of a combination of Darkseid and Doctor Doom, you know. And one of the reasons why people, I think, reacted so strongly to the first three films was that he did layer in this rich tapestry of characters that people could really dig into. You know, you would see something pass by, and then, you know, later on you would get a card, or in the comic or something, they would sort of flush out what these different characters were. And I think in comics, I always say it's like who, what, where, when. In order for you to believe in a fantasy world, you have to believe in it just like the real world. So you can take Batman as an example. As a character, without Gotham City, without Alfred, without, you know, all the other support, without his villains, he would be a much less interesting character. And when I worked on Superman on the cartoons, one of the harder things was the fact that he didn't have a rogues gallery besides Lex Luthor as like sort of like the main bad guy. So he didn't have all these different twisted, psychopathic, damaged people, you know. And I think that Bob Kane kind of took that from Dick Tracy.
Sure.
Dick Tracy had all those weird, you know, gravel head, flat top, you know, all so because you don't exist with just the main character all the time, you would get bored just following that one character around.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something that you said, Mike, which is the idea that, you know, what makes Lucas maybe successful in those first 3 films is how reliant he is on outside sources. And this is, you know, it's fairly well-worn territory, the idea that he's taking sort of fundamental sort of mythologies and mixing them together to create his own. Which I think leads into maybe a question of one of the things I noticed in Jamar's work. It's actually one of the, as we were going through, you know, piles and piles of the drawings that Jamar saves, and fortunately so.
Some would call that hoarding.
Some would call that hoarding. As long as we can still walk into the office, I think it's fine. But what, you know, one of the things that I sort of came to late in the process were to find these sort of sketches that were done on printouts that were clearly like images that had been taken from Google and just sort of printed out as a kind of research,
Right.
with these sketches then incorporated back in. So, you know, in the sort of same way that we're thinking about using sort of mythology or this other kind of even sort of like folk tales or something to discuss how we create a new world, could you talk a little bit about some of the outside influences or some of the things that you're taking from outside that are entering into the different worlds that you're creating for these particular characters?
Yeah, well, with the way I create things, I really lean heavily on my childhood. And I don't want that to come off as being passé or something like that, but
Tell us about your childhood.
were you hugged, Jamar? You know, growing up in West Philly in the 70s and just kind of growing up inside the end of disco and the birth of hip hop, really, really, really connected on my psyche and connected to the way I tell stories and how I create things. As an aside, one of my thoughtless doodles, you know, when you're just sitting and talking on the phone and drawing, are always like little guys with flat top haircuts. It's just because, you know, I had a box, so this guy needs a box. But a lot of my work is connected to hip hop and to race in a certain degree. It's not the number one main focus of the way I draw or I create, but it's there. Also, my environment, graffiti is a big part of my upbringing. And, you know, Saturday morning cartoons, animation, like all that stuff that people talk about that kind of sticks to you, all those kind of adhesive things that you connect with as a child. They never go away, and it kind of comes out in the way your brain processes things. I was just saying the other day in the office that I think I played a little bit too much of Atari. You know, it's
Too much Atari?
too much. I mean, it was great at the time, but
Tank battle?
too much tank battle, too much asteroids, and I just see it. Is you know, it's all in here, and it's still swirling around in there, and it comes out in my work. Now, referring to you talking about reference, and there are some images out there on the wall that have their printouts of like a police officer from the 50s. Those images are things that help me refer to the content that I'm creating if it's for someone else, especially. Like Fist Stick Knife Gun was a project that was presented to me by a publisher, so I'm essentially on the clock, and it's my job to tell the story in an engaging way, and I can't just kind of make it all up, so I need to keep things on and a realistic source, a realistic kind of folder.
So, for example, where those are contained in the show is when you're doing Fist Stick, which again is a memoir of somebody else's life.
Right.
You feel more of a need or an inclination to having kind of a historic reference.
Sure. I mean, it comes out very strongly in a graphic novel that things need to feel like they're in the right time period. What is that word? It just fell out of my head. Anachronisms? Like when you see cowboys with wristwatches on?
Yeah.
And when things are just a little off. And it's really my job to make sure things like that don't happen. What's really interesting about Fist Stick is the story is about Jeffrey Cann, who grows up in the mid-50s into the 60s, 70s in the South Bronx. And little boys dress the same way that they do now. Chuck Taylors, white t-shirt, blue jeans, same haircut. So it's important that I tell this information in a different way. What do the cars look like? You know, what does a police officer in the 50s look like? And that's one of the images out there. So I have to keep even if I don't, well, I'm not copying, but even if I have to make sure that I'm referring to these images in my work. The cops were really important to me. They had to feel like a 50s police officer who's kind of looming over you with all these cords and belts strapped across their chest. And that was a big part of what little Jeff was seeing, so I can't cheat that.
Yeah.
You know, I can't make him Boba Fett.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
It breaks you out of the narrative. So especially when I'm doing someone else's work, I have to make sure it's true to the source.
Sure.
And I can play with that a little bit more in my own work, but there's still a kernel there.
This is and so I have a question for you too, Mike, about something we were just talking about, which is going to lead into this also. But
Should I leave?
No, I hope not. Would break up the composition. So do you feel like there's maybe more of a limitation of creative freedom if you're working with somebody else's characters or somebody else's story, especially a true story? Is that sort of something you found inhibiting in that process? And I'm going to bring this up with Mike, who is, you're currently drawing Judge Parker.
Right, yeah.
You were telling me a story about this, so I want you guys both to respond to how the world building process is affected when you're working with somebody else's material.
Well, Judge Parker started, I think, in 1953, and I am the fourth or fifth artist, excuse me, to be on the strip. And when you come on a strip like that, characters have already been very well established. So, of course, they don't age, but the fashions would, like they used to have pork chop sideburns, right, in the 70s, because that's what everybody had.
Yeah.
But I think it depends upon your personality. Some people work really well within that environment, and other people find it very stifling to work in that environment. I like being part of something that is, I guess, a classic now that's been around for a while. One of the issues, like I was telling you before, was when I took over the strip, the writer Woody Wilson wanted to take the youngest daughter, Sophie, and age her to be a teenager to where she could start, driving and things like that. So, of course, I'm drawing her like as I look at like modern teen fashions and try to draw that. And of course, you have people who've been reading the strip since 1953, and they're like looking at her and seeing suddenly she looks a little older, and they don't like that. They want the character to always stay 9 years old or whatever. So there are challenges with that, but again, I think it depends upon your personality, your likes as a creator. Some people are great working as part of a team, and other people would find working on something like that to be too restrictive. I find it to be a challenge, but also in a different way than, say, working on something like Marvel or DC, where you're really dealing with a lot more exaggeration You know, I'm drawing a lot more. I think of it myself in a way as sort of like a more boring version of Dallas. You know, I think that the characters seem to be like that kind of, you know, soap opera, you know, and so things don't really ever get that dramatic, but, you know, it's different than, say, working at Marvel where I would get a plot and then I would contribute a lot to the story. I actually, on the strip, you actually get a full script which spells out everything. It gives you all the dialogue and everything. So it's much more formal, and I end up, I mean, I do have a lot of leeway, but not as much as when I would just work from a plot. So it's a little bit different.
Sure, sure. Same question to you.
Well, one thing that I think is important when you're working on other people's stuff is that you kind of, even if it's sneaky, you slip a little bit of yourself into the work. If you're a comic book fan and you follow, let's say, Spider-Man, for example, Spider-Man kind of looks the same, like since he's been around for a while. But every artist that draws them puts a different spin. Ha! See what I did there? I did
Spin, web, yeah.
puts a different spin on the character. So in the late 80s, when Todd McFarlane kind of reimagined the character, he had super big bug eyes.
Yes, he did. Yes.
Yes, he did.
Well, there's a documentary that just came out where he discusses that at length. Not that I want to spend a lot of time talking about Todd McFarlane,
That's
but
okay.
like the idea of like the spinning web, the spinning circular
Oh,
web.
the spaghetti webs.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, when this one artist started drawing Spider-Man, he changed the way his webs looked. Before they were just kind of like lines with like little connectors to it. But he kind of made these big like spaghetti ropes with things kind of twisting and just connecting all through the webs, and they called them spaghetti webs. But he didn't change Spider-Man really. He just put a little artistic license on it. And a lot of times that's just to make yourself interested, to keep yourself intrigued with it. Sometimes it's not enough that you get the keys to Superman. Like, what's Mike's spin on Superman going to be? You know, you're going to give him a mullet or something like that.
Yeah, super mullet.
Super mullet.
So, you know, there's that. You still have the chance to make it fun for yourself and put a little bit of a mark on it as well.
Yeah. That's what I was looking for.
It's, okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Speaking of other comic book artists, again, I think one of the things that this exhibition is trying to do, or maybe it does, is to talk about the kind of a sort of creative process in general. I think we happen to be focusing on the creation of comic books, but something that occurs to me in looking at the work out there are that there are specific techniques that I think can actually be applied to a large genre of different kinds of work. Whether it be, I mean, the thoughts that occurred to me were like doing preliminary sketches for installations, or even sort of preliminary drafts for like even like sort of studies of scientific illustration sort of occurred to me. So while the show is hoping to talk about world building and creative process in general, at the same time it's also showing your creative process and your world building in general. So maybe, I don't know if this is something you've really thought about, but this is sort of a question I would kind of put it to both of you, is to talk a little bit about how you think your approach to world building, or sort of there are aspects to your creative process that you think are different from perhaps other artists that you know, or other comic book artists that you know. Like, is there anything sort of specific or unique to your own process, or are there little idiosyncrasies or?
Well, there's a lot of that, and one very interesting point about comic books is that there's no one formula to creating comics. Almost every comic book creator has a different style of working. So I also teach writing for comics at Drexel, and it's hard for me to explain to the students that if I just told you how to write comics, we'd have one class, and then there'd be 9 weeks of us just, you know, making paper hats or something like that. But it's really all in the style and your method of working, which makes it different from somebody else. What's really important to me and Mike, we can maybe talk about this in a second, is that I don't have a formulaic approach every time I do a project. Every time I do something different, it kind of comes out in a different way. There's been times where I was working on a project and I decided I really like this paper. I'm going to draw this whole book on this stuff. And then the next time, I can't stand to look at, I don't want to get it out of here, you know. And I don't know where that comes from. It just happens. I mean, that's, you know, that's a little part of it.
Yeah.
One really important thing to me, and usually confuses people when I tell them, is that I rarely work in a linear fashion. With Fist Stick Knife Gun, I had to kind of work straight across because the editor, you know, I was making her crazy, trying to, okay, here's chapter 6, and oh, here's chapter 3. How's that look? And she's like, what are you doing? Can you just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And that threw me off for a while because my mind just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So I kind of skip around. Even on the comic page, when I'm almost at the point of finishing it in ink, you may think that you may start at the top left corner of the comic page and ink your way through it. But I jump around, and I like that nose. I'm gonna ink that nose. Oh, I'm gonna go over here to that building. You know, whatever kind of interests me at the time, and then when it's done, it's done. But I jump around a lot. And Mike, I'm sure you have a different style of working too.
Yeah,
right?
I'm like a baker. I have a recipe that I pretty much follow in order to be able to produce the volume of work that I have to produce with something like the strip, as well as other things I'm doing. The only way I can produce a consistent level of work is to basically more or less bake the bread the same way all the time. Otherwise, it would lead to a lot of waste, and I just literally don't have the time to do that. I teach storyboarding and storytelling at the University of the Arts, and right now we're actually sort of dealing with this with the junior students who are working on their junior, or the ideas or the stories for their junior films. So it's, you know, the need of the film sort of creates the matrix for your story. And you know, some people are natural storytellers, just like everybody knows. People can tell you about them going to the Wawa, and it would be a very entertaining, a really funny story. And they just have a natural knack for being able to tell you something funny. And then you have other people who could have you could have the best comedy writer up here write material for them, and they would just blow it every single time. The timing would be off. It would just be very awkward. And so I do find, while there are not maybe always exact recipes, there are strategies that you can employ when you're learning to do the craft of storytelling that make the process easier to follow and be more consistent. Because in the end, that's what makes Spielberg, or Hitchcock, or Francois Truffaut, is they have a consistency to their work, which is why we like their work. We react to their work. So I tell them to think of it in a way like being a detective. If you're going to investigate a crime scene, which is a story, like what happened here? Who was this? Who lived here? How tall were they? Did they have any distinguishing marks? You follow from that. Then you basically have a list. And from that list, you can start to edit that and splice that together, and maybe that will start to gel into a story. And that usually even helps the person who has the hardest time with telling a story. Or I will say, this semester, we used Little Miss Muffet for their comic book story. And I said, you know, you can change it from Little Miss Muffet, you could change it to a cyborg, you know, but it gave you you had a beginning, a middle, and end. You had, you had a conflict, which makes a story interesting if you have conflict, right? And then you have a resolution. So you can change the specifics of the characters and the locations, but you could use that framework. And I think fairy tales are great examples of very simple world. Hansel and Gretel, it goes right in everybody's head. And you understand the world and the evil witch and everything. And you can take that and build on it. And I think that's why they have survived so long,
Right.
because they're very simple and everyone can understand the story and the world very well. And they relate to every age, as well, because they're very strong, condensed little stories.
It's interesting the way you're talking about it. To me, it occurred to me the thought of asking those sort of basic questions of who, what, where, when. It also almost, it's sort of a strategy in journalism, in the sort of the way you would teach somebody to write an article for a newspaper, is sort of that, has that same sort of basic structure. Again, it's happening allegedly in the real world.
Well, it's like a factual story.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, that sort of parallel. And I guess it's, again, it's one of those sort of duh moments, but we have two guys here that are both comic book artists and also educators. And so, in sort of picking up on that sort of line about, and I think we have a few students out here. We told them to come. But it's to think about, I'd like to hear you guys talk a little bit more about teaching world building. And so Mike was sort of picking up on sort of some strategies that he conveys. So maybe I could ask Jamar if there are some strategies that sort of you go to in your sort of toolbox to help when you're teaching students.
Well, I do have a go-to project when I first start teaching comic book creation, kind of like your Miss Muffet. I have two of my early ones are, you have one page to show the reader how you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
One page? Would you say one page?
One page.
Okay.
No words.
Ugh.
Okay. And that sounds simple enough, but usually by the end of the class, they're like,
Do you give them just one class to do that? Or
sometimes it's homework. It depends.
Okay.
It depends on what kind of time we have. But that's a early exercise in storytelling and timing and being clear to a reader. I spent a lot of time explaining to the students that now that you're at this level, you have to get out of the habit of telling stories for yourself. Now you have to make them clear for other people. Now there's other entities reading your work, and if you lose them, they're not coming back. Meaning there's arrows pointing from panels to panels to panels, and that's usually an amateur device in storytelling.
Yeah, I've done that, the peanut butter assignment, and you would say, well, if someone was reading this comic, could they actually make a peanut butter sandwich?
Does it work as a recipe?
Right, because you might forget to say, oh, I forgot to show them taking the bread out of the bag, or I forgot to show, well, where did you get the knife?
Right.
And I've taught little kids, and with them what I do is I'll just draw a 6-panel grid. I'll give them a sheet of paper. And I even do this with my older students. I'll tell them to write out the words, and then you can actually draw a stick figure. You can draw the worst drawing you've ever drawn, because the point is to break your story down, to concentrate on what the story is first. Then you concentrate on the drawing, because most people love drawing. And what will happen to the young artists is they will concentrate on drawing all the stuff they love.
SpongeBob.
Right. And then at the end, they have all the windows and the doors and all the stuff they didn't really figure out. I'm not sure what's going to happen in that panel. And then that usually sabotages. It's like the building will collapse at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really where you find a lot of students struggle at the beginning, because they come into the class with a love of the material.
Yes.
I really love anime. That's great. What does this have to do with drawing comics? They're two totally different devices. And having to kind of settle them down and say, look, there's mechanics here. You know, your wristwatch tells you what time it is, but if you open this, there's lots of little gears in here. And if one falls out, it stops working. And it's the same thing with comics. You may lose a few students because, oh man, this is hard. Yeah. I've had students say, you know, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. Mm-hmm. I don't like this anymore. Like, well, what did you expect? You know, well, I know what they expected.
Yeah.
And you know, that's where the teaching really begins, right there. When we get past kind of like the illusion of what comics look like as printed matter, and get your feet wet and start learning how to do this stuff.
And I can sort of attest firsthand to being sort of a young, like wanting nothing more in the world than to draw comic books when I was, you know, 13 through the ages of 21. And I can sort of relate to students now who are sort of also interested in this kind of thing, because for me I really sort of relished the idea of like the pose and the posture and the character creation. Yes, you know, I can draw this really well. But when you actually had to put them in some kind of context and some kind of sequence, it becomes a kind of challenge it's a whole, you know, it's a whole different level.
You have to draw Clark Kent, not just Superman.
Yeah.
You got to draw the office of the Daily Planet, not just, you know,
Yeah.
him punching some guy through a wall.
Superman's apartment. What's on the wall?
I don't know.
Superman doesn't have a toaster.
As he uses his laser.
That's right, yeah. He doesn't have anything as an apartment, right? Yeah.
Yeah. He has a bad dream. Yeah, there's nothing there. He just wipes everything out. And we're back. Okay. So, one thing I wanted to come back to briefly was something you'd mentioned when you kind of approach each project, that you sort of approach things in a little bit different way. For example, like, I'm going to do this entire project on one kind of paper.
Right.
When you say that, I sort of notice it now in the exhibition, whereas maybe I didn't 100% notice it before. Since we have 3 different characters that are being or main characters that are being represented out there, could you speak to some of the idiosyncrasies that sort of come up in each of the 3 characters in terms of how your approach was maybe a little bit different?
As far as like materials or just
anything, materials, process. I mean, one thing that stands out to me, for example, now that I'm thinking about it, is that Detective Boogaloo down at the end is earlier work, but there's a lot more. I guess we were presented with a lot more sort of color designs, and as going through the imagery, there's a lot more sort of poses of the main character, maybe as compared to some other things. So I'm just wondering if there were any sort of particular process changes or idiosyncrasies that came together in the process for each of these different characters.
Okay, well, I'll touch on them all just briefly.
Yeah.
Well, with Detective Boogaloo, you can see outside that almost every strip looks a little different, or every sketch looks a little different. I was working on that project at a time where I was just trying to find just anything to make marks on. And it kind of comes out in the work. It's very rough, and it's rough on purpose in places. A lot of that roughness comes from my background with hip hop and graffiti, and a big part of Detective Boogaloo as a character is he embodies, just as an example, a graffiti character come to life. Sure. So if you saw a big mural with a guy who's like, you know, with the profile, and he's got his big Puma sneakers kind of sticking out at odd angles, that's this character. Even with the outline of the character is thicker than everybody else's, and it's a nuanced thing, sure, but it's there. And it also, I don't need to explain it to everybody. You can catch it if you want to catch it. But I didn't pay a lot of attention to the materials I used for it. I almost didn't want to think about it that much. I just wanted to get it down. You know, it's rough, it's organic. I use a lot of black sketchbooks. As graffiti writers use, they call them piece books, to put a lot of their characters' designs in, or their mural designs. I use things like that. Now with Fist Stick, I'm now thinking about my editors, or the publisher who's breathing down my neck. And I want to make sure that things are flowing in a way that I can easily send them work. So I was thinking more, like I said, linearly earlier, and also I was thinking about documenting everything. That was the first time that I ever thought about keeping sketches.
As opposed to like drawing something with a Sharpie, which might fade away, or fugitive material, or whatever.
Right. I had never thought about that before, but with Fist Stick, I started keeping. I had a file box that I was keeping the chapters in, and I started putting the dates on things, and a few other gallery shows that I've had Fist Stick Knife Gun work in. This is kind of, I don't know how you feel about this, but I have a peanut butter jar with the pencil shavings in it. I don't know, that sounds a little creepy, but I gave it to one of the curators. He's like, oh, this is really cool, I'm gonna put it in. And other people were like, really? Why do you have pencil shaving? But to me, that whole project was a huge growing process for me. And I wanted to save every part of it, even the blue pencil shavings. And it's just in my studio on the shelf, and it's whatever. But for some reason, I couldn't throw anything away. And luckily I didn't, because look, here we are. But I think that spoke to Jeff Canada's maturation. I wanted to because Jeff didn't have a lot of stuff to give me. Here's a quick little aside.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk too much. When I started the project and I connected with Jeff Canada, and I needed the manuscript so I could adapt the story. So I called my publisher, who one would think they would have such things, and they said, "Oh, we don't have that. Well, you don't have a digital copy of the book that this is based off of? No, you should probably ask Jeff." So I called Jeff in New York, and he says, "No, I gave it to them." So it's like there again, you have real world, snafus in an office. It still happens. The intern threw out the manuscript.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't think anybody needed it. So again, just saving things kind of came into that. So just with the way I created the manuscript, I had to take one of the prose books and I ripped it apart, and I retyped the whole thing, just so I could start to move things around. So there was a process of saving things, and that was really prevalent in that project. Now with Leon is a little bit different, where I'm doing a lot of just I'm figuring out Leon. What's really cool is that my girlfriend is a principal, and she lets me come around once in a while and take pictures of things, and I ask her really silly questions, like, what's a sixth grader learning in class? Do they go from class to class, or are they in one room with a teacher? Oh, well, it's like this, and other. And I just write that stuff down. So it's more, I'm researching now with that, and it's really not super important about what kind of paper I'm drawing it on. I'm just trying to get Leon's world right.
Yeah.
I hope that
Yeah,
answers it. Okay.
that's wonderful. We're actually coming up close to the end.
What?
Yeah.
We're having so much fun.
We are. But I was thinking that maybe people had some questions, so I was hoping.
Does someone have a microphone?
We do. Sam's got
Hi,
the
Sam.
microphone.
Isn't Sam lovely? Give Sam a hand.
Yeah.
Our lovely curator. Thank you, Sam. Did I have batteries, Sam?
Yeah, if you guys want the opportunity to ask some questions.
Please raise your hand.
And Sam will come running over.
There's a question in the back there. Just let it,
Talk into it.
yeah. Use the business end. I think you turned it off. Where's Matt? Is he around? If it doesn't work, just speak up and we'll hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
there's a power to that, which can either build, or you can build or destroy with that. But Mike, do you want to answer that?
I think when I worked on something myself, I go through and I structure it all out. So I work all that out. So I wouldn't actually start drawing it until I knew, if I have the beginning and have the end, I can sort of fill in the middle. Again, it's sort of like, I think of myself as like a detective or, some writer in some old movie where like, well, how would he escape from, the flaming truck going over the cliff? And then you try to put yourself literally in your character's position, and, you sort of figure it out that way. The thing that I've noticed about artists that I grew up admiring, a lot of them worked for the other companies, and so when they would have the opportunity, you even see this with fine artists, when you have the opportunity to have absolute freedom, it's like opening the door in the barn and the cow can go anywhere it wants, and the cow doesn't actually know where to go because the cow is used to going in like a certain place or being pushed over to go into a certain place. So sometimes that can be a little daunting for people, but I mean, part of being an artist is you have to be willing to make a mistake.
Can I add to that? And that's a really tough place to be as a young creative, where you have no boundaries. One of my very first comic book was all over the place because, one, I didn't really know the language yet. I thought I did, and I knew enough to figure out how to get it published and get it into a comic book store. And my very first review from the Comics Journal was, Jamar Nicholas has some talents, but he's all over the place. I'd like to see him in a few years. Like, see me after class. Yeah. And sometimes I wish I had a little bit of that back. Your head is stuffed with theories and, the 180 rule and all of these other things that kind of restricts you as an artist. But those things are good for you. You have to reel yourself in, not to self-censor. That's not what I'm saying. You have to remember that it's not about you, even though it's your project. Like I said earlier, it's about communication. It's about communicating to your readers. And it's not about making your character super cool, man, with the popped collar and all that. Your fans will dictate if something is cool or not. Okay, you draw what you know. When they say write what you know. And it kind of comes out in your work. It's a natural thing. But you can't give it, here's another one, another thing I say all the time. You can't feed the bird the whole loaf of bread. You got to put it a little, you got to break it up. And
you can, but it's not pleasant.
Well, so
it's not to be done. Yeah.
So if you have a super big idea, this is going to be an epic 138 volume, tell us one story out of that. Tell us about the Ice Princess and how she gets to be the Ice Princess.
I'm glad you asked.
Okay, and then just kind of bring it in, because you may have all these ideas and you'll stop yourself from ever doing anything because it turns into a lot of work. Just start at the beginning and then see where it takes you. So that's my answer to that.
Great. There's some questions down this way.
Did you get the mic working? Okay.
So, with Canada,
well, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. I'll answer it. Well, the first thing about meeting Jeff Cann is that he's very overwhelming as a person. He's kind of like a superhero. He's a very tall guy, and he's just so calm. If you've ever met, like a famous person, and you're like, oh my God, you're so amazing, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you very much. That's something that I've been trying to learn how to get when I get to that point, but he's so very surreal to meet as a person, and working with him, he's just a normal guy, and that's another thing about meeting your heroes, and we could talk about that if you want to talk about that. But as far as being in this universe with Jeff and his work is very humbling, and it was also very connective, because the things that this young man went through in the early 50s and the 60s in the South Bronx, let's say there's a chapter in the book where he's like 5 or 6 years old, and he's going to the store for his mother, and some kid befriends him in the supermarket and then puts his arm around him. Hey, man, I'll be your friend. That happened to me. That's decades in between. It's the same narrative. Growing up and having to defend yourself, even if that's not in your gut to do.
Not a fighter.
Yeah, you're not a fighter. Or things that you just have to do. And what connected me to the story was when I read the prose, the same stuff happened to me. And that was what made that book so important, that the same stuff is happening right now. With the same looking kids, with the same Chuck Taylors on, with the same blue jeans on. And that's really my message to people who read the book is, also part of this is I wanted the kids to kind of look the same. And I wanted you to feel like when you read this book, oh wow, it looks like a kid who lives in my block. He's probably going through the same stuff. So there was a connectivity to it that I could relate, even though we were decades apart, and it's still the same story. So it was really special to me to be able to add to that universe. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you. Mr. Torchia has a question.
I wanted to make 2 points. First of all, I don't know if Sam has given herself credit for curating the show. So we have to thank her. And then I'm glad that Mike mentioned crime scenes, because one of the reasons we're actually standing here now is because of the show in the gallery. So, and I think that's open.
Yes, it is.
Until
I took care of
that. So if there's anybody here on campus who has not seen the show in the gallery, it's called No Bingo for Felons. It's about art and crime. That exhibition is open until...
It's open until you have seen it.
So anyway, that was a nice gateway to mention our reason for being here. But the other question I had was something that comes from looking at the drawings in the show, which is, and this is to both of you, the question about muscle memory. And for example, how many times you draw a particular character, whether it's a character that's been given to you or a character that you invent. I wondered if, like a signature, at a certain moment, the spacing of the eyes, the nose, if that becomes something that it's just sort of internalized to the point that you don't even think about it anymore, and you can just, the character draws his or herself, and I mean, I'd like, because that's part of the continuity that makes world building persuasive, right? And maybe if you could talk to that, I think it would be interesting to hear.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Mike, do you want to?
Well, I've done different things like, work in animation. So when you're drawing, let's say if you're drawing Mickey Mouse, it has to look like Mickey Mouse. Not my version of Mickey Mouse, but it has to look like the version of Mickey Mouse. So one of the skill sets I had to acquire early was the ability to draw on character. Same thing with Judge Parker, even though it's really my strip now and I do draw the characters in my way, I had to look at the previous artist to sort of learn how to draw the characters, and now the characters actually live in my head and I can draw them without having to use photo reference. I would love to be able to use photo reference like all the classic old comic strip guys did, but I don't have enough time and they don't pay me enough money to be able to be like Alex Raymond and hire the models to come in and pose. So, but yeah, muscle memory, I think, is really part of being any artist, whether you're a painter or a cartoonist, a sculptor, whatever. Especially in, I would say, in cartooning, because yeah, the characters do, after a while, you know, if you're drawing it and it just doesn't feel right. You know, it's like that doesn't look the way the character should look, or I'm not happy with the way the character, or it doesn't feel right. And that feeds into, you know, being a teacher, because that's one of the hard things for young artists is consistency. And the only way you can get consistency is to literally just put your ass in the seat and draw for hundreds of hours. And I think that's something that Jamar and I really have in common, is that we really love drawing more than anything else. And it's hard to be good at something if you don't love it. It's hard to be like, you know, well, I'm going to be a weekend golfer. You're never going to be able to play with Tiger Woods if you do that. So there's no magic pencil or no shortcut. And if there were, I would have all the magic pencils and I wouldn't give them away to anybody. I'd keep them all for myself.
They're always out when I go to the art store.
Yeah,
the
really.
magic pencil shelf is always empty. I think that was a great answer. I don't really know what I can add to that.
Are there any other questions? It looks like there's one
There's one over there.
over this way.
I would just, you both, at any point in your life that you had thought
I was pretty serious about being a professional artist. When I was 13, I decided that I wanted to work for Marvel Comics, and I actually played sports in high school and was actually pretty decent at playing sports, but I actually quit playing sports because I wanted to be a professional artist, and so I pursued it. You know, I think sometimes my parents didn't really understand, like, why he's always in the bedroom drawing? What's wrong with our son? Now, of
He's
course,
broken.
you know, they realize that he really was always crazy, but hey, he's making a living, so it's okay.
Right.
But yeah, I have thought, well, okay, if I wasn't a comic book artist, maybe I would have been a psychiatrist or a vet. But
A vet psychiatrist?
yeah, pet psychiatrist. So if you have any problems with your dogs or cats, you'd like to come up and talk afterwards.
That's right. For me, I always wanted to draw. What's a little different for me is that I didn't really want to be a comic book artist when I was younger. I wanted to be a cartoonist, and that is an overlapping title that I wear with pride now. There was a point where people didn't like that term because cartoonist meant, oh, hey, Johnny, you like sailboats? Here's your big
Yeah,
fat
with a
head.
big head and a sailboat.
Everybody likes skateboards.
I'm fishing.
I mean, that's different. That is really different now because
Yeah.
because comics are so accepted and such geek culture has become the modern culture. So when I was a teenager, if you went to a Star Trek convention, you were a geek. All right, but Bill Gates would go to a Star Trek convention, and all those people run the world now. So
Right.
you see cosplay everywhere. I mean, the convention thing, there's like 1,000 conventions a year now. It's exploding. People dressing up
Yeah.
in cosplay like every weekend. They can't wait for Halloween. More adults go crazy for Halloween than any other holiday.
Yeah.
You know, and I think part of it is because you're creating your own world and you're getting into your own thing when you're dressing up for your, you know, your night of mischief.
Right.
All of that, but
Real quick to finish up, like what I was into when I was a kid. I always loved drawing, and I always wanted to do just that. My mother's an artist, and some of my best memories were hanging out in her studio and stealing markers and things like that, and just trying to figure it out. And I have very old characters. I had a whole world. Hey, look at that. I had a whole.
You have prehistoric characters.
That's
now?
right. Yeah, they go back to the soup. But I had my own characters then, and I didn't really know what I was doing with them. They all had their hands behind their backs,
That's wise.
and they all
That's wise.
smiled.
Yeah.
And one kid had a flat top. box. But I remember specifically that I wanted to be Dr. J at one point, and then I realized I'm no good at basketball, and I'm short, so that didn't work. And I also wanted to be a psychiatrist.
Really?
So, yes.
So we could open up a practice together.
We'll do basketball and animal veterinary psyche.
There you go, yeah.
But if any of the students on campus have ever sat down and talked with me, you know I'm good at kind of like helping you out with your problems, you know what I mean? And it kind of comes out back in just, you know, the way I deal with things. But I never wanted to do anything else, and I'm really blessed that I can do this now and make a living at it. And there was a lot of stoppage, you know. Like Mike said, nowadays, this is popular culture. People go, wow, you draw comics, that's so cool. When I was a kid, all I got was static. There was nothing but resistance. All my teachers hated it.
Put your comic books away when you read them in class?
You know, that never happened to me because I never wrote my comics in school. But
yeah.
I saw it happen.
It was too likely they'd get damaged at school.
That's right. I had to keep them in that protective.
Yeah. They stayed in the vault.
Well, now because they want kids to read, they are like, comics are cool because, you know, that's actually getting kids to read.
Yep.
Although I have a funny Halloween story that a couple years ago, I would always give out comics for Halloween instead of candy. And the parents would be like, oh, comic books. And this one little kid gets a comic book and he goes downstairs and he's showing it to his mom. She goes, oh, that's great. And he goes, no, it's not. I have to read it. So he just wanted a Snickers bar.
Yeah.
So I guess that answers that. Yeah. Thank you. That was a good question.
Any other questions?
He's just stretching.
No, there's
Okay.
one in the back over here.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I love your hair.
Thank you.
You're
It's
welcome.
not spiked up right now, but.
Oh.
So I'm going to assume that you guys have a shoebox somewhere full of old story ideas and characters. Do you ever try to like work them in and stick some character in the background that looks like some other main character you wanted, or stick in some scenery that looks like somewhere else that you really like, or anything like that?
Mike,
I actually turned Jamar into a character in Judge Parker for like 6 months. He was a character called Angel in this storyline, which was a lot of fun. Yeah, I have I think every artist, probably every cartoonist has old ideas that you have rustling around that maybe one day you will do, but it's kind of hard in my case between the pressure of keeping up on the strip and, you know, being a MFA student and a teacher. I don't really have the time to do my own comics, but maybe after I graduate, I've thought about going back, and because I did actually self-publish some stuff starting in the 90s, and I still have plenty of them in my attic if anybody wants some. So,
sort of put them out back at the back of the room. When I started doing weekly comics back in the late 90s, I was really good at hiding things in panels. You know, I'd put little messages in somebody's soup they were eating and things like that. And I was all about just trying to see if you're paying attention. If as my reader base was a lot smaller than what I would just, you know, call my buddy Jason up and go, did you read my last strip? And he would go, yeah. Did you get the thing I drew in there? I wasn't paying attention. And I would that was kind of my way of just seeing if people were really reading it. And I don't do that as much, but I do have, Mike has, you know, rooms of things, but I have a file folder in my, file cabinet in my studio that's full of old yellowing projects and ideas. And there was a point where I was being really efficient at cataloging all this stuff, and it's still good. Sometimes things just aren't ready for the world yet. One of my old managers in comics told me when I was actively trying to pitch things to Hollywood, said, you know what, nobody's really into Westerns. So, and you know, obviously that's all over the place now, but things always come back.
Yep.
Everything is cyclical, so I don't really throw anything away. It may just not be time yet. I don't need to insert them into things because, they'll come along later, so I'm just holding on to them.
Great. There's one more question up. Maybe we take one more question and then.
And we can buy things in the back of the room.
Yes, there. Well, yeah, I have some. Yeah, I'll make some brief announcement, but let's hear what.
Okay.
I wanted to, I've talked pretty loud. I guess I wanted to ask, maybe this kind of bounces off from what you were saying, where you have a file cabinet of all these characters. Because my question that I was thinking initially was, how do you choose a character from all these ideas and decide, like, Leon's going to happen. Leon is going to be real. And I wanted to ask, in general, how do you decide that this character is going to exist more than another? And specifically about Leon, because it's something that you're working on, why is Leon, why is the Leon, the character, Leon the sixth grader, why is that important to you? Why is that audience and that focus important to you right now? Why do you choose Leon?
That's a good question, Nadia. Thanks for asking that. Well, sometimes things make themselves apparent because I feel like there's a need for it. I created Leon like maybe 98, something like that, and he's just been hanging out in the back of my head. He's a little bit of an offshoot of a failed syndicated comic strip called Avery, which I was going to draw about myself as a teenager trying to meet girls, and it wasn't really good. But
Well, yeah, you got to make comics about what you know.
that's right. But there's parts of Leon in there. I kind of shaved off certain things that didn't work for other things and kind of like attached them to Leon. Also, I try not to follow trends because if you try to, I'm going to draw a zombie comic because zombies are really popular, and then by the time your zombie comic's out, nobody cares about zombies. Oh man, I wasted all my mom's money. So I try not to follow trends when I create things. I felt though with Leon that there was no voice for little kids to hear. Again, when I talked about race and culture in my work, all of my characters are African American, and that's just what it is. There's really no agenda behind that. I don't stomp my feet and make a big noise about how I create characters or if there's anything behind that. But if you follow everything that's popular right now, like Wimpy Kid and Harry Potter and things like that, I don't think there's ever been a little black superhero besides Static Shock or something like that.
Yeah.
Or like Cyborg. I hear people whispering, well, what about it? But as a lead, think about it. Cyborg's in Teen Titans and he's in the back and he's mad all the time. You know what I mean? And I feel like with Leon, there's a voice that I have that I can use to shout at the world about things. Like, it's really cool that there's this little kid who has a uniform he goes to school in, and then when he comes home, his mom makes him put on his play uniform. So there's little things like that I'm playing with. Single parenthood. He's a latchkey kid. He doesn't really want to be famous, but there's a character in it that follows him around and tries to profit from him being a superhero. All those little things kind of tie into what's going on in the world, but I'm not shouting it. Also, there's a character who has a YouTube channel, and he's always talking about Leon and trying to get famous off of him, and fame is another narrative that's running through my work these days as far as what students feel is important these days. Being famous is super important to a lot of people.
More important than even being good, just being famous.
Yeah, I need YouTube hits. I need followers. I need people to like me. All of that stuff is it's smoke. And a little of that plays into Leon, how he just wants to, help kids, and that's it. So it's the right time for Leon. And maybe when Leon comes and goes, if he goes, then it'll be time for something else. But it just kind of tells me when it's time. I don't kind of go through the files and go, oh.
Gut thing.
Yeah, it's really a gut yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Cool, thank you.